In 1911, John Mahoney, a freight handler at Chicago's South Walker Street terminal, was overcome by heat prostration. That in itself isn't all that unusual. Heat stroke is not uncommon during Chicago's hot and humid summers, but what was strange about Mr. Mahoney was that he was overcome by heat stroke on November 11th. It was, according to newspapers at the time, the first incident of heat prostration in Chicago in November. And to make the situation even stranger, the very next day, two men were found in Chicago, frozen to death. There were many terms used to describe the extreme temperature fluctuations and violent weather that gripped the nation that week, but the one that is most common today is the Great Blue Norther of November 11th, 1911. There is a weather phenomenon that's not uncommon in the world's temperate zones and especially well known in America's Central Plains. The National Weather Service described the conditions. In general, it is associated with a rapidly moving cold front, usually in the autumn, that causes temperatures to drop quickly and often brings with it precipitation and unsettled weather, followed by a period of blue skies and cold. Such weather events can include rapid temperature shifts and at the point of the front damaging weather such as tornadoes and hail. Often simply reported as a cold front, terms like nor'wester, blue darter, blue whistler, and blue blizzard are used regionally, but in Texas, the most common term is blue norther. Texas Monthly wrote in 1982, kids in the panhandle climbed windmills and water towers to watch the northers blow in. On clear fall days, a white cloud rises from the prairie and quickly envelops the horizon, the upper part of it assuming the shape of an anvil. Because the low clouds are wet and stormy, the horizon often turns bluer than the sky above the cloud mass, hence the term blue norther. The Texas State Historical Society explains that the term is peculiar to Texas, but the explanation in Texas Monthly is just one possible genesis of the term. There are, the Society notes, three folk attributions for the genesis of the term. As Texas Monthly described, one is the norther sweeps out of the panhandle under a blue-black sky. A second says that it's a reference to the blue sky and cold that follows the front, and a third says that the blue part comes from the fact that one supposedly turns blue from the cold brought by the front. These events are not uncommon. In 2016, author Gail Flockins wrote about a temperature change from a norther spooking her horse to sorrow. The temperature had dipped 25 degrees from a few hours before. The wind's sharp whine outside the barn colder still. Weather changes that fast in Texas. Texas Monthly argues that the phenomenon is unique to Texas, which, while protected from Pacific cold fronts by the Rocky Mountains, is particularly vulnerable because only the Great Plains separate the Gulf of Mexico from the Arctic cold fronts that we call northers. No other continental area on Earth allows strongly contrasting air masses to move so freely. But of course, the American Great Plains are all still subject to those same conditions, even if they don't generally use the term blue norther to describe them. For example, the Weather Service notes such a storm in Oklahoma in March of 1989 that caused temperatures in the 70s, followed by 40-degree temperature drops in a matter of hours, bringing damaging hail and followed by a blizzard and a foot of snow. Another occurred in Oklahoma in November of 1995, with high temperatures in the 80s in the morning and snowfall by midnight. But among these storms in history, one stands out. The National Weather Service writes that we must go back further in time to look at one such cold front that established a set of weather records that arguably are unique in modern weather history. Although the extreme weather unfolded over a number of days, the period of rapid temperature changes started on November 11th, 1911. The National Weather Service writes that the passage of this cold front was historic for the rapidity of temperature falls as it passed through. And on November 11th, 1911, the central U.S. experienced one of the most dramatic cold waves to affect the United States. The Denton, Texas website, We Denton Do It, was a tad more direct in their language. And boy howdy, a winter apocalypse it surely was indeed. The events were the result of a number of conditions. A high pressure system started in Canada as early as November 9th, pushing cold, dry air south. And a low pressure system formed over the Rockies on the 10th, moving east. Wet and warm air was drawn ahead of the system, bringing record high temperatures. The front, the line between the cold and the warm air, was stark. Northwest Iowa, near the South Dakota and Minnesota borders, saw highs in the 10s and 20s on the 11th. But in the southeast of the state, the town of Keokuk hit a high of 79. Record high temperatures were set across the plains. 83 degrees in Oklahoma City, 76 degrees in Kansas City, 74 in Chicago, 73 in Milwaukee, 70 in Battle Creek. Springfield, Missouri reached 80 degrees. The town of Chico, Texas reported it was still clear and hot till late in the evening. The town was crowded with people, lots of men in their short sleeves, girls dressed in white, low necks and short sleeves. It was reported that Chicago sweltered in a temperature that broke all records for the month for 23 years. But the cold front kept moving, eventually engulfing the entire eastern United States. The record highs quickly gave way, sometimes in a matter of a few minutes. Oklahoma City, having set the record high at 83, also set a record low for November 11th, 17 degrees, a 66-degree drop in a single day. The Weather Service writes record high and low temperatures occurring on the same day are rare, but they do happen. The hard part, though, is not setting both records, but keeping them without one or the other being broken or tied in later years. In this sense, the pair of daily records at Oklahoma City on 11-11-11 is unique because of the amazing length of time over which both the record high and low have survived. Across the plains, many places saw temperatures fall 50 degrees in a single hour. Denton Dewitt writes that the transition from summer to winter was a matter of little more than minutes. In Denton, it was 85 degrees at 5 in the evening. It was 68 degrees by 6. By early on the 12th, it was 22 degrees. Denton Dewitt continues. They went to sleep eating ice cream in their sweaty shorts on Saturday evening, only to wake up the next morning desperately trying to fire up their wood stoves. In Springfield, Missouri, the temperature dropped 67 degrees in 10 hours. Towns in Iowa that had seen highs in the 70s on the 11th saw lows of less than 10 degrees on the 12th. But it was more than the drop in temperature. When such different air masses run into each other, violent weather tends to result, although the idea was poorly understood as the concept of storm fronts hadn't yet developed. Springfield reported that by 2:30 p.m., a dense greenish black bank of clouds was rising along the western horizon. By 3:30 p.m., dark and ominous appearing clouds extended along the northwestern horizon, and at 3:45 p.m., the wind shifted to the northwest and immediately reached an extreme velocity of 74 miles an hour. A witness in Chico said, "We saw a large flock of wild geese and the blue norther with his horns and tail up. Sun then was an hour high, but in 5 minutes it was darkened." The coming blizzard had traveled from Canada to Texas in just over 7 hours. In Denton, out of the west poured an icy blast that cut like a knife, that whirled dust and small pebbles through the air as from an air blast and made it impossible for pedestrians to see a few feet ahead. Denton Dewitt wrote, winds were gauged over 50 miles per hour as the sand snowstorm hit as hard and fast as a tequila hangover. The storm brought 75 miles per hour winds to Springfield, where sleet was falling less than 2 hours after recording 80-degree heat. Rain, hail, sleet, and snow were all reported in a period of less than 2 hours. The Chicago Tribune reported, sandwiched between a sultry day and a snowy cold night, a terrific wind, rain, and electric storm burst over Chicago at 6 o'clock last evening. Blocks of poles and trees were blown down, frail buildings upset, service on at least 2 streetcar lines discontinued, telephone and electric light service hampered, plate glass windows demolished, and basements flooded. But the most destructive were the tornadoes. The Weather Service reports that it was the worst tornado outbreak ever seen in November in the north-central U.S. Severe thunderstorms erupted from the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Great Lakes, spawning destructive tornadoes in parts of Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan that killed at least a dozen people. Strong winds behind the cold front reached 30 to 50 miles per hour in many areas, with gusts over 70 miles per hour in some locations. The high winds tore a barge from its towing ship off the New England coast. 14 crew members were given up as lost. The Western Union newspaper service reported that nearly every public building in the village of Virginia, Missouri was damaged, including stores, churches, theaters, and city property. The New York Times reported that 23 died and 50 were hurt in tornadoes in Wisconsin and Illinois, including 5 members of the Smith family in Rock County, Wisconsin. Splintered timbers, broken furniture, crumpled rock and plaster, scattered farm produce, and dead farm animals littered the ground in an area a quarter mile in width and 20 miles in length, indicate the tremendous force by which southern Wisconsin's worst cyclone swept a path through Rock County. A bride of a few months was instantly killed when the house was carried away. Her husband stood in the barn door and saw the house disappear and discovered the body of his wife after the cyclone had passed. A steady downpour of rain added to the confusion and made identification of the dead difficult. And following the temperature shift, the tornadoes and thunderstorms and hail and rain, came the blizzards and the cold. The Weather Service writes that within an hour after the tornado struck, survivors were working in blizzard conditions with near 0-degree temperatures to rescue people trapped in tornado-damaged debris. Meteorologist Hannah Strong of Louisville's WDRB notes, records show blizzard conditions hit Rock County, Wisconsin, within 1 hour after an F4 tornado moved through that same county. Texas Monthly writes that Texas's worst norther of record pushed panhandle temperatures to 23 below, left a thin sheet of ice on Galveston Bay. subjected valley citrus groves to a freeze of 12 above, and chilled marrows as far south as El Salvador. Denton Dewitt writes that the freeze swept in so fast, ranchers in Bolivar lost a devastating portion of their herds while they slept, and said that they had cattle freeze to death standing up as the beast wandered lost in the whiteout. In Chicago, a day after Mahoney was overcome by heat stroke, 2 men were found frozen to death. In Columbus, Ohio, Columbusites who had been walking around in their shirt sleeves on Saturday afternoon made their way to church Sunday morning in a light snow, with ice forming on the puddles and a bitter wind blowing out of the northwest. Des Moines, Iowa was described as encased in ice. Bitter cold took over parts of Canada and the upper Midwest. Lows of 25 degrees below zero were reported in the Black Hills of South Dakota. The Bloomington, Illinois Pantograph reported that the cold wave extended itself in a few hours to the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard, and that several persons were frozen to death by the sudden cold. The poor in the large cities and the homeless in the storm-swept regions suffered severely. Pittsburgh received considerable snow. Cleveland suffered the coldest November 12th in 40 years. A blizzard gripped the city of Toledo. In Kentucky, there were losses reported throughout the Commonwealth, where the Weather Service writes homes and barns were unroofed, and telephone, telegraph, and railroad services were greatly hindered. Louisville, Kentucky was cut off from communication with surrounding cities for several hours. 43-year-old George Platt, described as a recluse, was found frozen to death in his cabin near Ottumwa, Iowa, while 60-year-old night watchman P.C. Campbell froze to death while walking home near Omaha, Nebraska. It's not clear even today how many people died in the Blue Norther of 11/11/11. Newspapers reported that scores of people were killed in the tornadoes and windstorms and the thunderstorms and hail and in the bitter cold and blizzards that often came quickly and without warning. And of course, in addition, millions of dollars in property were lost, livestock was lost, crops were lost, ships were lost on the Great Lake. Many places set temperature records that day for both highs and lows, and many of those records still stand today, more than a century later. The storm was reported many ways, but today it is almost universally known as the Great Blue Norther. And the Weather Service notes that the people that experienced it remembered that day for the rest of their lives. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.